Welcome back to Books That Bite. Today we're going to be talking about memoirs. I mentioned in my intro video that memoirs are one of the genres I really love, and I wanted today to do a little top 10. These are 10 memoirs by women that I have really loved and that I really think anyone could appreciate. These books are all so special to me, and I just wanted to share them with you all. And in case you haven't read memoirs before, maybe inspire you to give the genre a try. So the first book I'm going to talk about is Wild by Cheryl Strayed. As you can see on the cover, this became a movie starring Reese Witherspoon. Classic take of a memoir. This was published in 2012, but it recounts a hike that the author Cheryl Strayed went on in the 90s. I think it was 1995. Something that's so incredible about Wild, a lot of you I'm sure have already read it because, it's 12 years old and it's very famous. But what's so incredible about this is you can really see the journey of healing happening in real time. So the memoir takes place during one long hike that Cheryl went on up the Pacific Crest Trail, the PCT. So you learn about the logistics of hiking, like her boots and where she stores her food, and there's a lot of fun anecdotes of who she encounters along the trail. And this is a solo hike she goes on. But what I think is more remarkable about the story is it's interspersed with flashbacks of an extremely troubled period in her life where she was dealing with drug addiction, she had a failed marriage, and dealing with the loss of her mother. And the way it's told, and just you get these little glimpses of her life before, but the meat of the story is her every day waking up, putting on her boots, feeding herself, going on a hike, reading a book, going to sleep. You get the dunce, 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 like the rhythm, the pace of her hike. You feel like you're there, and you can see how the hike healed her in so many ways. And what to me makes this such an excellent memoir, and this is kind of the standard I hold other memoirs to, is it's not enough to just live a cool life. You have to reflect on it, and she's a writer. She also wrote the Dear Sugar column, which is incredible and became the book and Hulu series called Tiny Beautiful Things. When I'm looking for a memoir, I look for someone who has, processed their life, thought about it as deeply and as beautifully as Cheryl Strayed did. I think part of why this is so good is, like I mentioned, the hike she did was in the mid-90s. She didn't publish this book until 2012. So she really thought on this experience for almost 20 years before she wrote about it, which is why it's so beautiful, I think, because she really knew how she felt about this by the time she put it down. It wasn't just a reaction. It was a really great response. So if for some reason you haven't encountered this book, I would give it a try. The next book I want to talk about is another throwback. This is The Complete Persepolis by Marjane Satrapi. This is a beautiful graphic memoir of the author's experience growing up in Iran, and she recounts from a child's perspective what that experience was like in the 1980s. And I actually read this in high school, which I think a lot of people did. And this was the first graphic novel I ever read, and I was actually shocked at how much I loved it. Wasn't sure how well I would like the story, but I mean, it's beautiful. It's stunning black and white, and it's immensely readable. I read this so fast. But what I love the most about this is how she is so unafraid to make herself look bad. And I think that's what makes a good memoir, is the true vulnerability of exposing yourself even at your lows. So this is like a blistering look at her own adolescence. She ends up moving to Vienna and rebelling a little bit. She feels as though she lets her family down at some point. And I remember as the reader, I was an adolescent reading this around her age, and I was like, oh girl, you really are letting your parents down. Like, you really are messing up right now. And by the end, she does recover, claim her life back, and start living in a way that feels more truthful to who she is. But that honesty of really showing her lows and showing mistakes she made makes the book, it's searing. Just like Wild, I think what's so good about this book is the author had some time to live with her experience before she wrote it down. Like I mentioned, it starts in the year 1980. It's not published until 2000. So again, there's that period of reflection before putting your life to paper. that enabled her to see with such clarity what her life was like growing up in revolutionary Iran in the 1980s. I've never seen the film. It says now it's a major motion picture. If anyone has seen it, if it's good, let me know. But this is great. I think I'm actually going to read it again with adult eyes and see what I think. The next memoir I want to shout out is Lab Girl by Hope Jahren. This was published in 2016. I picked this up when I was in college because I thought, I don't know, like, oh, it's a woman in STEM memoir. But it's so much more than that, and that's why it stuck with me over all these years. Something I love about this book is kind of how, remember I mentioned in Wild, the tone and the majority of the book is the rhythm of her hike. You know, the drum beat of the hike going along, and it's interspersed with these flashbacks to her experiences. There's something similar in Lab Girl, where the rhythm of the book is her research, getting the PhD, applying for grants, traveling the world, finding these discoveries, and it's interspersed with these absolutely beautiful, breathtaking moments from her life, some of which are related to science. She ends up going to the Arctic at one point, and she describes this incredible scene. I think she's standing on the edge of a glacier, and just the way it causes her to reflect on life. There's also a big theme of this book is the really close friendship and relationship she has with her lab assistant. She's kind of unique in that she has one lab assistant who follows her to all the different labs she goes to. She makes sure he gets a job when she gets a job. So that their friendship is a great thread. And there is a part when she does get married and have children. This scene is so beautiful. It's pretty short in the context of, you know, her life. It's just like something that happened to her is how it's portrayed, but in such a romantic, beautiful way. The author also, I believe she has bipolar disorder. And so because of that, when she's pregnant, she has to stop taking her medication. And that ends up having, you know, she ends up having a very traumatic pregnancy and birth experience because of that. And I like how she leans into that. But again, like I mentioned, I really like memoirs that in which the character really changes from the beginning to the end in a positive way. And for Hope, that's definitely the case. The way she writes about her life is really, really beautiful and very inspiring, I found. Because, you know, against like the monotony and the minutia of her experiments and her writing, she's able to see this bigger picture that's really beautifully coming together in her life, which is excellent. And who wrote the blurb on the back but our very own Cheryl strayed from Wild. Any memoir list on an LGBT channel would be remiss not to include Fun Home. So like Persepolis, this is a classic coming-of-age graphic memoir. Stunning. This one's more of like a blue and white. But it's really great. So if anyone's been living under a rock, Fun Home was published in 2006 by Alison Bechdel. She is the author who, she had the comic strip Dykes to Watch Out For, and that's where the Bechdel test was originated. But this is the author's life herself. Alison grew up in a funeral home. That's why it's called Fun Home. Her father is a funeral director. And because of that, there's already like a dark whimsy to the backdrop of her childhood, but it really is a much more tragic story. It's the combined experience of her coming out as a lesbian and also finding out that her father is not only gay, but he's also a pedophile. And what's so beautiful about this book is that blending of tragedy and comedy, and her hopeful experience versus, you know, uncovering this dark secret of her father's is very tragic. So you have those two juxtaposed against each other really beautifully. And this has also just become like an essential queer text. I actually first read this in women's studies in college. It was assigned to me. And now this is a musical, which I didn't see, which kind of sucks. I wish I had. But so many things from that musical have just become such a part of our culture. There's a moment where Alison, she sees her, like the first butch lesbian for the first time in her life. And Alison's a child. She sees her and she recognizes something in her that she relates to really strongly. And the way she articulates it as a child is, oh, it was her Ring of Keys. And that became a song, Ring of Keys, in the musical. And I know a lot of people really relate to that symbol now. There's also this song that just reminds me so well of the feeling of this book, changing my major to Joan, because in college her first girlfriend is named Joan, and they have this awakening experience together, which is really beautiful. So this, again, it's a complex family coming of age story. You follow Alison through these tumultuous years. At the end, she's really found herself, and she's trying to grapple with her childhood too, because she did have a lot of positive memories with her father and having to reckon with who he is versus who she thought he was. So if you haven't read this, if you're avoiding it because of the pedophilia, okay, avoid it. If you're avoiding it for any other reason, please pick it up. This is an excellent book that I would recommend to anyone. The next memoir I want to shout out is Hijab Butch Blues by Lamya H. This is an excellent memoir that was just published in 2023. It's actually a pseudonym of the author. The author herself is not out to friends and family, and she's still able to publish this by using a pseudonym. She doesn't show her face in any of her author photos, which adds a level of mystery. It's really fun to juxtapose Hijab Butch Blues with some of these other classic LGBT coming out memoirs like Fun Home, because in Hijab Butch Blues, Lamya's situation is different. She doesn't have this arc of coming out and achieving acceptance and being able to live out and proud. Lamya is situated in between two cultures, two worlds. She grows up, she doesn't even tell you the name of the country she grows up in. That's how anonymous she is. But Lamya is a butch lesbian who is also Muslim and very devout, and she grows up in a Muslim country, moves to the United States. She ends up getting a PhD. And you don't even know what the PhD is in, so there's a lot of mysteries there. But what it's actually about is her coming to terms with her own sexuality and finding a way to really hold both sides of who she is. She really deeply does care about her religion, and she does not want to discard it. She enjoys wearing the hijab. She finds a lot of meaning and solace in her religion and her community. And at the same time, she knows or suspects that many of her family members would or could not accept her if she were to come out to them. So there's so much rage in this book, which I really love. And a lot of the rage is directed at white American queer people who preach coming out at all costs for anyone at any time. She's so mad at this. She doesn't view coming out as the end game. She views having positive, meaningful relationships with her family and her partners. That to her is success. She's also very poetic, and something I do love about this book is she actually walks you through a bunch of different stories from the Quran, and she'll retell them through experiences she's had in her life, how she views the scriptures differently after her experiences. It's just that unfinished business of this book where she's like, I'm not going to give you a happy ending, and you have to be okay with that. And it makes you uncomfortable as a reader, but that's the point. It's like, oh, okay, it's not going to be the end and they lived happily ever after. It's like she's always going to be grappling with these different things, and she's not going to give you what you want as a reader. She's not going to show her face. She's not going to tell you her name. She's not going to tell you where she's from. She's not going to come out to her family. And it feels like, oh, there's all these things she's not going to do. But what she does with this book is incredible. And some of what makes it so good is that restraint. This is not like an info dump. Everything that's in there is in there for a reason, and you find yourself savoring all her words. In a podcast about, I think it was about the paperback release of Hijab Butch Blues, Lamya did mention that they're now a parent, and it will be really interesting. She did tease maybe there will be a sequel memoir, and it would be fascinating to see what their relationship to their privacy is like now, via the experience of parenthood, whether or not they're out now to everyone in their life. And it'll be really interesting to see what she does tell us in the second memoir, if we get it, which I hope we do. There is a 2014 memoir by Janet Mock called Redefining Realness, My Path to Womanhood, Identity, Love, and So Much More. It was a groundbreaking memoir in that it reached such a wide mass appeal as a memoir of a trans woman. Other memoirists since, you can tell, have really been inspired by the format she uses. So Janet grew up in Hawaii to a multiracial family. She was always accepted as trans by her immediate family from a very young age, and it's really more out in the world where she faces discrimination. Janet walks you through her experience as a sex worker in Hawaii and how she was able to obtain gender-affirming surgeries and care. She moves to New York and lives stealth for, I forget how long it is, I think it's a period of maybe 10 years. this story is something that could only happen in the early 2000s because she starts writing for a fashion magazine and immediately becomes like rich and famous from that. And I'm like, oh girl, if this was 5 years later, that industry would have been dead. So she really cashed in at just the right time. So she has almost 2 lives before she even turns 30. 2 adult lives that are very different. Her life in Hawaii with a bunch of other trans women in her inner circle, and she has that sense of community, but she is working in sex work, so she doesn't have the same feeling of security that she'll end up finding in New York. And then she has this second adulthood in New York where she's very successful by, financial means and societal measures, but even none of her friends in New York know that she's trans. And eventually she does come out to these friends, and that's like the arc of this story, is knitting together those 2 sides of her life. So I guess that's another theme we're seeing in memoirs. A lot of these memoirs are about people trying to hold 2 sides of themselves and how often healing comes with being able to blend them together, although Lamya would say it's not always possible or necessary. The second half, it's very like Sex in the City. Like, she moves to New York City, she's successful, she's beautiful, she's going on all these dates, she's rich, she has her friends. And part of me is like, oh my God, like, whose life is like that? But hers was. and what was missing was that she wasn't authentically being herself. And actually, there's another memoir, I think it came out in 2023, Horse Barbie, which was another memoir of a trans woman who similarly had 2 lives before she turned 30. One where she was out as trans, where she was a beauty pageant winner in the Philippines. And then she similarly moves to New York City, lives stealth, and becomes completely famous in a second career. She did this too. They both grew up in the Pacific, and their family was welcoming. They both moved to New York, and like society at large was less accepting of their trans identity, but financially they were able to achieve more success. And then in the end, they were able to have both, which is amazing, inspiring, and almost uncanny, the similarities these 2 women had. The next memoir is The Glass Castle by Jeannette Walls. This was published in 2005, which, now that I'm looking back at this list, were the early 2000s a golden age of memoirs, or did I just read more of them then? This is another memoir, like Wild, like Persepolis, like Fun Home, that has been adapted, in this case, into a film, which was good, but not as good, obviously. I think something that can make or break a memoir is how much the author reveals and when. So I mentioned that one of the factors that makes Hijab Butch Blues such an enthralling read is the restraint Lamya shows. And then I mentioned in Lab Girl and in Wild, there's this rhythm and you get interspersed with changing events. And none of them are info dumps, and that's why I think they work so well. The Glass Castle takes us a step further because obviously it's written by an adult, but for the most part, she's telling you the story through a child's lens, how she felt as a child. And it's only through glimpses that you realize how dangerous her childhood actually was. Jeannette Walls and her family grew up in Appalachia, and the book chronicles this nomadic experience she had growing up. Her father was an alcoholic. Her mother struggled with mental health issues. And again, those are 2 things that are just, you see glimpses of. But what you mostly see is through her childlike eyes, how much she believed in her parents as a child, particularly her father. He was charismatic, and she describes him as one of those people who, when he was in, low moments of his alcoholism, would be, violent and terrifying, but he also had moments where he could, sell her anything and she would believe it. So the title comes from the fact that he kept promising her and her siblings, since they kept moving from place to place and didn't have, a real safe home, he kept promising her that they were going to build a glass castle. And there's this heartbreaking scene where she and her siblings build the foundation because they think her father's going to come along and build the rest of the castle. And obviously, those illusions are shattered as she grows up, but it's paced so well. And that gradual change in the way she sees her parents is just spelled out in such a brilliant way. She's one of these people, which a lot of memoirists are, who has these extremely humble beginnings and then somehow becomes extremely wealthy and ends up living in Manhattan, which just happened in the last 3 books I listed. But this also happens to Jeannette Walls. And I think because she ends up at this place of success later on, she looks back and she's like, oh, there's some things I still have to process from my childhood, and some things about me that the new people in my life in Manhattan don't understand, which this is a major theme I'm sensing now. I don't know what's going on all these memoirs I picked where the New Yorkers can't understand them as much as the people back home can, but I like New York. I don't understand what all this hatred is, but anyway. The next memoir I want to include, I love this book, The Race to Be Myself by Caster Semenya. Caster Semenya is a South African runner. She is an Olympian. She has multiple gold medals, and she had this experience in 2009 where the IAAF, which is the international foundation that governs track and field sports, investigates her gender. She is accused of, I guess, not being a woman, competing in these women's sports, and she is put through extremely invasive sex tests without her knowledge. Caster just published this book last year in 2023. Like I mentioned, she was all over the international news in 2009. So she waited almost 15 years, I guess, after that experience to sit down and come out and finally tell her story for the first time. This is an excellent book of someone who is so loyal to her family and who was really mistreated on the international stage, mostly by Europeans in the IAAF. I think it's remarkable that Caster came out with this story because, she received so much hate. Not only was she abused by doctors, but also by the press. Time passed. That story faded from public view, and she chose to come out again. Although she's married now, she has daughters, she and her wife were living a happy, peaceful life, and she chose, no, you know what, I actually do want to set the record straight. I want to say what happened to me from my point of view. And she does so beautifully, and she is angry too, and I love that she doesn't dampen that to be more, I guess, acceptable to her readers. She is furious at the way she was treated by the IAAF and by the press, by the media when she was only 18 years old. But again, like I mentioned, there's so much love in this book too. So much love for her family, so much love for her coaches, so much love for Nike. She's obsessed with that brand, which you can see she's even wearing Nike on the cover. So she loves Nike. But there's so much love in her story and so much anger at the way she was mistreated. And it's very timely, unfortunately, because even though this happened in 2009, we saw a similar level of gender hysteria at the Olympics this year in women's boxing, and she really calls out the racism and homophobia that she sees in international sports. It's a great book for, I think, everyone, because the way gender in sports are being litigated right now, it affects everyone, and you don't often hear enough the stories of people who are in the middle of those fights. Thank you to Caster for writing this. She could have just minded her own business and avoided the hate, but she came out again, published this. The stories from her childhood are really funny because she was just like not to be messed with. And also you get some glimpses into her like really cute, beautiful love story with her wife, who's also a runner. The end. This next memoir is totally unlike the other memoirs I've talked about so far, and I'm even a little hesitant to use the word memoir. Memoir is often a personal account of one season or one event in a person's life, one era, and an autobiography is more of a retrospective on a full life. This memoir was written by Betty Reid Soskin when she was 96 years old, and because of that, she has this incredible arc on the history she lived through. And maybe it is an autobiography, I'm not sure. She's still alive. She's 103 years old. The memoir is called Sign My Name to Freedom, a memoir of a pioneering life. Betty Reid Soskin now she's retired, good for her, but when she published this, she was the oldest serving national park ranger in the country, and she helped establish the Rosie the Riveter National Monument. That was one of her claims to fame, but she has many. And what I love about reading from someone with such a rich and long lived experience is the way she's really able to provide insights into aging. And something I've heard older people in my life say is, this too shall pass. When you hear that, sometimes you're like, okay, but right now this is everything. And then when I was reading Betty's memoir, I could really feel the meaning of that phrase. She was talking about this period in her life where her mother was dying and she was nursing her dying mother, and it felt like it was going to last forever. But now with the benefit of hindsight, we're like, oh, it's been 20 or 30 years since then. Like, she had a whole different chapter of life after that, and none of those seasons were forever, because with a person like Betty, who's lucky enough to live a very long life, you are able to reinvent yourself many times, to have many different experiences. Just some of the things she lived through. She did work at the waterfront during World War II. The working conditions were segregated at the time. She talks not only about her life, but also she gives a little family history in the beginning, including memories of her great-grandmother who was born a slave. But so she talks about her family history in Louisiana, her experience working during World War II. Then she has experience integrating an all-white suburb with her family when she was a young mother. In another life, she becomes a professor's wife, and she navigates the world of Berkeley. She, at some point, is a civil rights songwriter. And that's where the title of the book comes. One of her songs is called Sign My Name to Freedom. She has experiences with her children, including one of her sons who was gay and who ended up dying from addiction-related causes. A scene where she says, if maybe he had been born 20 or 30 years later, his life might have been different if he had seen the way gay people would achieve more acceptance in society. But a lot of people don't have the gift of the hindsight that she has. She's lived so much American history. She has lived so long and is still so perceptive and so willing to learn new things. I love that book. And I don't know if it's a memoir or not, but you should read it. She's still alive. She's still awesome. This memoir is Just Kids by Patti Smith. I will admit I was a Patti Smith hater for absolutely no reason. Before I read this book, it was everywhere. And I remember at one point I made this comment like, how many memoirs can one person write? And I was wrong. Because finally I shut up and I read this memoir and it's amazing. And I see the hype. And now I'm reading her other memoir. So I do see why. Some people do need to write more than one because they have just lived a very rich and varied life. You could do what Betty Reid Soskin did, which is live like 8 or 9 lives and include them all in one memoir, which was excellent. Or you could do what Patti Smith did, which is live a ton of lives and then write a different memoir about each one of those. So the one I'm talking about, Just Kids, is about her relationship with Robert Mapplethorpe, who's a photographer. He photographed the gay leather scene. I'm a little embarrassed to admit that I only read this book after the Taylor Swift song was released. And if that's what it took to bring me to literature, so be it, because it brought me there and I loved it, so whatever. It's a great song. Who's gonna love me like me? Who's gonna love you? Tortured Poets Department. Okay, yes. The Tortured Poets Department is a great song, and this is a great book. And you know what's actually great about that line, too? This ain't the Chelsea Hotel, we're modern idiots. Is in Just Kids, there's this running through line. So Patti and Robert, they were dating at the time. This is before Robert had, like, fully come out. He was, like, out the whole time, kind of, but they still dated anyway. What's great about that is when you're reading the book, there's this tension where Robert and Patti aren't sure, like they believe in each other and themselves, but the world doesn't. And there's a tension of, are they great artists or are they modern idiots? That tension exists even in the book itself. Are we just young kids with these dreams or are we actually going to be somebody? And, history did show they did both become very successful and famous with their work, and they were both incredible artists, but that uncertainty is part of what makes, Taylor Swift so great, is she was able to play with that feeling as well. Something I do love about this book is it's like an ode to her best friend, because Robert Mapplethorpe ends up dying of AIDS, at which point Patti is married to someone else and has children, and they're both successful, but they've, remained very dear to each other. And she reflects back on the time in which they were living together in New York, and they were really scraping by trying to make ends meet. And she describes, the difficult circumstances they lived in. There were times of, sleeping in the park. There were times where they were living in the studio, and they would, go to the bathroom in, a bucket. But none of that seemed important compared to the art they were making. The art seemed like the most important thing in the world. Some people have said this kind of name droppy, but I really love that, because if you're actually living a life in which you have memories of friendship with Janis Joplin, why wouldn't you include that? That those experiences she had really enriched her life, and they enriched the memoir too. They end up moving into the Chelsea Hotel. They have all these incredible experiences with poets, writers, actors, everyone. Something interesting about their relationship too that I haven't really read a memoir about before is they view each other as muses. He's her muse and she's his muse, so even when their romantic relationship ends, for a while they still are, the most important person in each other's lives. It was just a really great look into that period of life in New York. And now that I'm stopping, I'm like, I picked these 10 memoirs because I thought, oh, these are all 10 memoirs I've loved. But now it's like so many of them are about someone moving to New York City and making it big. So I don't know. I don't know what that's about. I live in New York City and I haven't made it big, but a lot of these people have had that trajectory. I guess that is a theme in a lot of American literature, is like the appeal of New York City. And I'm not a person who came to New York City. You know, I'm from here, so I don't relate in that way to like the draw of the city, but I guess I do appreciate these books about it, which I never thought about until I stopped and filmed this video. Anyway, so those are just 10 memoirs I liked, but there's so many memoirs out there. Celebrity memoirs are also great. I'm wearing this WNBA shirt because one of like the special mentions that didn't make the cut, but that I love so much, is Brittney Griner's memoir coming home. I'm also wearing this as a subliminal message that maybe some of my New York Liberty players will write memoirs. I'm looking at Stewie and JJ. I would love some memoirs from you too. No, JJ, you have to write one. Now that she was the finals MVP, there'll be some push for that. So keep your eyes out. There are great memoirs from all different types of lives. There are celebrity memoirs, athlete memoirs, but some athlete memoirs are also extremely bad. And that's because, like I mentioned, a good memoir is about when you have like enough time and space to reflect back on what's happened to you. You know, Castor, like she waited like 20 years to write hers, or 15 years or whatever. Sometimes you have a soccer player who has a memoir ghost written, and you can just tell that she knows she's famous right now, so she wants to write a memoir to capitalize on it, but she hasn't reflected enough on her experiences. And then you waste many hours of your life reading the memoir. Those things happen too. But there are a lot of great memoirs out there if you know where to look, and I hope you find some you enjoy. I think the best part of a memoir is, I think, being inspired by another person's ability to overcome adversity, to move through challenges, and to integrate different parts of themselves. A lot of the memoirs, like reflecting back on it, a lot of my favorite memoirs were about New York City, or they were about a person with multiple identities, multiple lives within one body, and they're able to merge them together. Those things are great. And even if the experience the person has is nothing like your own, you know, like being an Olympian, or I don't know, like growing up in revolutionary Iran, there's still something you can learn from a person who's willing to be vulnerable enough to share the times in which they were wrong, they were cringy, they made mistakes, they were just a kid, and they're able to grow from that. That makes such a good memoir, because we all can relate to that stuff. Even if we can't relate to the successes, we can all relate to the cringiness. So if you're able to get through that and turn it into something better, that can make a great memoir. So I hope you guys have liked this video. Don't worry, the other ones that I mentioned, those series I'm working on, those are still gonna drop. There's gonna be Ending Explained, there's gonna be Eating My Way Through Food, but I want to try something fun, talk about a genre I love, and hopefully pressure some famous athletes into dropping their own memoirs. Thanks for stopping by. I'll see you guys in the next video. Are you writing your celebrity memoir?